Thank you, Hannah. Hi, everybody. Thank you for showing up today, and thank you for inviting me to speak. I'm Jo Dunster. I work with UK Research and Innovation in one of our councils, the Arts and Humanities Research Council. I'm here to talk to you today a little bit about my reflections of working in a policy-facing role and kind of at the interface between research and policy, and what some things that I've learned in doing that role. So, the first lesson I'd have you take away from today is that the councils and UKRI can be useful intermediaries for you in enabling your policy engagement work. UKRI is this. It's what previously was the 7 research councils aligning to different sort of areas of research in the UK, plus Innovate UK, which is the government's funder of sort of R&D and innovation in business, and Research England, which is parts of what used to be HEFCI. So they take care of the QR-related funding for research. And we all sit underneath the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, which sort of, we're a semi-arm's length body. We're sort of in the middle ground between an arm's length body and a sort of non-departmental government body, which means that our budget is supplied to us by BEIS, and BEIS can to some extent attach conditions to the funding that they give us about how it must be spent. Not necessarily on what it must be spent, but how, and sort of the sort of priorities they want to see us address. That also gives us opportunities to talk to BEIS about things they might not necessarily have thought about that ought to be funded. So there's a two-way dialogue. A lot of it is BEIS telling us what to do, but there's also a certain amount of us saying, oi, there's something really interesting going on here that you might not have heard of. Councils themselves also have contact with government departments. Quite often these align with our, well, clearly these align with our areas of interest, so strong links between the Medical Research Council and DHSC, strong links between AHRC and the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport. Our exec chair probably meets with some colleagues of Rosie's quite often, and NERC, the Natural Environment Research Council, with Deborah, to cite just a few examples. This operates at a very high senior level as well as more junior levels, so I work directly with policymakers as well and feed into what they're doing. They're also strongly, you heard about the chief scientific advisors earlier, these academic figures who work alongside and semi-within government departments. They communicate regularly with our executive chairs, and we feed information in from both sides that helps them to align research, public funding for research with government priorities. So yes, use us, talk to us, get things into our attention, and we can get it into those rooms. AHRC in our turn approach this in, different councils do it in different ways depending on the way that they've developed, the links they have with different organisations, and to some extent the whim of the exec chair of the day. AHRC goes about this by brokering relationships, so we set up meetings between researchers and policymakers in areas where there's a policy need. We pay close attention to those areas of research interest, and we try to matchmake a little bit. We host events, parliamentary events primarily. We're looking to branch out, and we've held a couple of things jointly with the Scottish Parliament Information Service and the, what's it called, RAISE, Research and Innovation Service at the Northern Ireland Assembly. These bring policymakers and researchers together to talk about subjects that interest them both, usually over a cup of tea and a cream cake. We produce evidence on behalf of researchers in response to calls for evidence, consultations, public inquiries, things like that, as well as sort of less official routes. So we can sort of produce briefing papers as well. And we fund opportunities for researchers to bring them into policy contexts. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office Knowledge Exchange Fellowships are our sort of Rolls-Royce example, where an academic will be funded for 2 years at 0.8 of their time to go and spend time in the Foreign Office, learning about how policy is made and inputting through their research skills and also specialist advice. We participate in the Research Council's policy internship scheme, sending PhD students to different departments. We run capacity building for researchers, training courses like this, although I'd say not as good as this, and we develop and signpost resources for researchers. We also offer advice to researchers individually, particularly if they align with the priority areas that we're pursuing of the day. And we're involved directly with government in co-creating research projects through our Strategic Priorities Fund, which is a large sort of UKRI-wide funding pot. So use us, basically. That's part of what we're here for. Lesson 2, use your existing networks. You don't have to do all this from scratch. You'll quite often find that a contact of yours has a contact somewhere else. And an example of this from my own experience is in a project that I manage. We've recently received a £10 million grant over 5 years to produce and synthesize research about effective interventions against modern slavery and human trafficking. So the first thing you do when you receive a grant like that is think, who do we need to bring into the room on this? And we've got a fairly good existing network in different areas of research excellence, government departments who with an interest in it, primarily the Home Office, but also FCO, DFID, BAYS, and different companies in the third sector and the private sector as well who are involved in either slavery affects their supply chains or their labour force, or they have an interest in it from a journalistic or a campaigning perspective. One that we were struggling with, however, was the Ministry of Justice. Try as I might, I just couldn't find the right person there to interact with. So I had a chat with a senior colleague, just apropos of nothing whatsoever. I think we were talking about rugby, and I outlined to him my woes, knowing that he'd previously worked in the Department for International Trade, and lo and behold, he had a contact in the Ministry of Justice, which he was willing to introduce me to. It just all fell into place, and now we're well connected with them. As we've already covered today, policymakers are people too. And so my lesson from this is really around policy engagement relies on building relationships and becoming a trusted source, because people are more likely to listen to you if they trust you. And that means not throwing them under the bus on social media, which sure nobody around here would do, but I've heard from policymakers that it does happen. And often a sort of blocker between a policymaker who's maybe not familiar with academic researchers reaching out to an academic specialist is the idea that they'll then be on Twitter saying, oh, just contacted by so-and-so on email. They said they don't know anything about such and such, which could be a career-ending move for a minister or a senior civil servant. So it relies on trust. It relies on building up a relationship between you and them, understanding their needs, communicating what you've got to offer, and also being upfront about what needs to come out of it for you. Because if you need evidence for a ref case study, for example, it's good to be upfront about that and saying, I'm going to want a letter out of you at the end of this, at some stage in the conversation. An example of this, we have policy contacts, one of whom is Baroness Deborah of the House of Lords. She's a crossbencher. She was formerly a ballerina and a member of our advisory board. No, she was member of our council for many years. Deborah has an interest in the creative industries and asked a question about what consideration the government had given to adopting a broader definition of research and development that includes and incentivises research and development investment in the creative industries. That question is right at the middle of our intersection of interests, so we thought, fantastic. And in preparing to table this question, she contacted us to ask for evidence about the way that research categorisation or research and development categorisation affects the creative industries specifically. Knowing that we have a wealth of evidence about that we've collected from research projects that we've funded in the area, researchers we've spoken to, researchers we've commissioned to run to carry out studies for us. So we were able to give her to give to the person of whom she was asking this question a great deal of information. Put together a little dossier for them. We were asked to quarter it in size, and so we duly did, keeping in all the important figures and facts. When it came round to the answer, this is what Lord Duncan of Springbank came back with. Government's definition of R&D is based on factors outside of our control. Based on that definition, we give a lot of money to creative industries. Nothing in there about what they specifically do, nothing in there about why it's important. All of our effort in vain. Except it wasn't in vain, of course, because that dossier still ended up on the desk of Lord Duncan of Springbank, and other ministers picked up on that. I think Deborah herself didn't counter it because she obviously knew of the existence of that information, but another lord stood up and said, actually, I think you haven't really, sir, answered the question that you were asked. And so Lord Duncan was forced to provide a little bit more information, and there was a discussion around the House about coming back to that question at a later date and having a look at these criteria that negatively impact on the creative industries. So the trust had to be there between the research councils and the office of the sort of lords who were putting together the dossier of that information, and also on us to see that even though the information that we had supplied wasn't necessarily used in that instance, it's still there. There's still access to it. Somebody knows now that that work exists and it's sort of on their radar, and also to sort of keep moving with it even though that hadn't necessarily been a successful intervention. So to summarise, my takeaways for you would be to use your existing networks, including us. You can count me as part of your network now, and UKRI if I can be of assistance in any way. And invest time in developing relationships with people, because it very often pays off, and even if it doesn't, you sort of learn a little bit more about what their interests are and the potential for real-world application of your research.